And I'm going to start our live Facebook feed. And then I'm going to introduce Robin.
And shall we say too, Kate, before you do that, you have the option in the second half of the hour. I want to open up to questions from people, and you have the option that if you don't want to be recorded, send your question in the chat room. Just type it in, and understand, please, that we're unlikely to be able to get to everybody's questions, but every question will be useful for everybody, regardless. And so you have the option of just coming on live and speaking, and you will be recorded. This is going up on YouTube afterwards, or just send your question in privately in the chat room.
And I can read it out loud for Robin to hear and others to hear as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and welcome you, Robin. I'm going to read a little bit of an introduction. Welcome to everyone who's now watching us live. My name is Kate White. I am the director of the Pre and Perinatal Healing Online Learning Community and the Center for Pre and Perinatal Programs. I'm also a practitioner, and I've been working with Robin over the last, I don't know how long now, Robin, to bring, to bring this beautiful work of the inner child journey to people who want to learn the technique, who want the method, to incorporate that in their practices. And Robin is a well-known educator and speaker. So I'm just going to read a short bio of him and we'll get started. Robin Grille is a Sydney-based psychologist, but no longer Sydney, right, Robin? You're
Correct. We have left our home of many, many years and decades, and now we're traveling around Australia.
All right. So he's a journeying psychologist and a parenting educator. He's on his own journey. And his articles on parenting and child development have been widely published and translated in Australia and around the world. His first book, Parenting for a Peaceful World, received international acclaim and led to speaking engagements around Australia, the USA, UK, Canada, Indonesia, New Zealand, and Hong Kong. His second book, Heart to Heart Parenting, is also available in German and Korean. Robin's work is animated by his belief that humanity's future is largely dependent on the way we collectively relate to our children. Inner Child Journeys, How Our Children Grow Us Up, is his newest title. Robin's experiential, skills-based, and informational parenting courses have helped many people to embrace parenting as a transformative personal growth journey. Drawing from 28 years' experience and from leading-edge neuropsychological research, Robin's seminars and courses focus on healthy, emotional development for children, as well as parents, while building supportive, cooperative parenting communities. So please, go ahead, Robin.
Thank you, Kate. It's so good to be with you once again. I'd be missing you, Kate. It's been a little while. And I'm looking forward to a new course starting up next week. We can talk about that later. And everybody, welcome, very, very big welcome. And I thank you so much for being here and helping me to talk about a subject that this is really going to be new for me. And it was new for me. The subject of forgiveness snuck up on me very unexpectedly as I was writing my last book. I really did not set out to talk about forgiveness in that book. It dawned on me how much it was a subject matter that carried forgiveness within it, and I'll be clearer about what I mean about that as I go. I'll share with you that I'm kind of uncertain about forgiveness. I am in a process of discovery, exploration, and I'm really you might find this a strange thing to say, but I'm quite happy that I don't really know what forgiveness means, and I'm glad not to have a very clear definition. It's more a process of kind of like walking into a very, very interesting forest, and a very exciting, beautiful forest, and discovering more. And I'm at the point that I want to share more about it, and that I have a sense that it's a shared experience that you already know about very deeply. It's what gives me a kind of pause is that it feels to me that forgiveness is such a loaded subject. It has so many associations for people that are religious. It is talked about so much. I think I see an assumption that we have a shared definition of what forgiveness means. And I find that when I scratch a little bit, if you have 10 people in a room talking about forgiveness, it ends up being 11 different senses of what forgiveness might mean, different variations of what it might mean. So, but I'm glad for that. I'm glad that it invites discovery. We don't always need to know the exactitude of what something is. It becomes more of a journey. And as a therapist, a psychotherapist, I think for a long time I was aversive to the conversation on forgiveness, because the way that I witnessed the dialogue around forgiveness was too often around an expectation for people who have been very injured, very wounded, and are angry. Like an expectation, a moralizing or moralistic expectation to forgive. That somebody would say, look, that's enough of you being upset and angry. You've been carrying this too long. It's time for you to forgive. As if forgiveness is an act that one can, it's an act of the will, that you press a button and up comes forgiveness, without an explanation really to people of what forgiveness actually means. And that's often troubled me. It's troubled me in particular insofar as the expectation to forgive and the burden that places on people, and how very, very, very easy it is for us as human beings to split off from our darker feelings, to pretend to ourselves that to squash down those feelings that are that we devalue, the feelings that are supposed to be bad, the angers and the resentments, and how we split ourselves in half. How easy it is to pretend that those feelings aren't there anymore. But the danger involved in that is that if I give myself the expectation, the kind of the injunction to forgive, in the hope that that will free me and make me a better person somehow, a more lovable person, and then I shove a forgiveness statement onto myself, I forgive you, you who have hurt me. It's the danger in that is all of the remnant anti-forgiving feelings that I have inside myself. I see that turning into shame. I see that turning against other people. I see that turning into illness. It's trying to design the outcome, and in so doing, being dishonest with ourselves and swimming against our own current. So many times I've seen people act like or pretend to forgive, and maybe God will love us more if we are more forgiving people, and then afterwards, when the anger or the resentment or the hurt leaks out, we become tremendously ashamed of ourselves. Oh my God, I thought I'd forgiven, and here I am being angry. That means I'm bad, etc. What's going on in that is that the first person that we should be forgiving is ourselves, and we haven't, until we've done that, until we forgive ourselves for those feelings that our culture tells us are negative. We're not supposed to feel angry for too long. We're not supposed to feel resentful for too long. Those feelings that we call dark, the feelings that we devalue, the jealousies, the hatreds, the vengeance feelings that are so utterly normal. If we don't complete the self-forgiveness, how can we forgive anybody else? And what does forgiveness even mean? So often when you look under the hood of what we say is forgiveness, what it really is I forgive you for being a bad person. That's not forgiveness. I'm still thinking of you as a bad person. And that's why I resisted the idea of forgiveness and the dialogue about forgiveness for a very long time. I didn't like it. It felt like an expectation rather than going with the actual current of what's really happening in ourselves. And instinctively that I feel like the first thing to accept is our own, what in psychology is called the shadow, making a safe place for our own shadow. Before I get into the that pious position of forgiving the offender, forgiving the other, what is there in me to forgive? And can I turn my forgiveness to myself? So the acceptance of our own shadow. And how does that come? How do we do that? So I really laid that conversation to one side for a long time. But even without using the language of forgiveness, it dawned on me that there is a process in our interaction that happens all by itself. It happens all by itself. In the same way that I can't decide to get warm, but I know how to get warm. I'll walk to where the sun is shining. And then the warmth happens all by itself. There's a decision that I'll make to go to where the warmth is. But if I know how to do that, then the warmth happens all by itself. And I think, what if forgiveness is something like that? The subject for today was about the role of story. Let me explain what I mean by that. I have taken a sabbatical from my work for a year from my work as a psychotherapist, just my one-on-one work. But I did that for about 28 years. And my experience so often was that even when I'm sitting with somebody who's done something terrible, something violent, something awful, somebody that I'm sitting with that I'm finding it very, very difficult to like them, difficult to accept them, that I find myself very challenged by that person's way of being, their acting out. And we all have our buttons in our different places. We're all judgmental and unforgiving in different ways to each other. And so many times I've sat with people that inside I'm feeling intensely, like it might be initially on our first meeting, like I just don't like them. I'm worried about them and the way they treat their families and all kinds of things, the way they treat themselves. But in the same way that to get warm, go and stand where the sun is shining, if I leave myself with curiosity in the conversation, as I begin to hear the person's story, and here's where story becomes, for me, a discovery that I'm very, very excited about. And it's not that I think that this is the way to forgiveness. I don't know that there's one way. I'm sure that there isn't. I'm sure there's hundreds. This is the one that I'm sharing about today because I'm very excited about it. There's an alchemy somehow that comes from hearing the other person's backstory. I've always, without exception, found myself sooner or later in the conversation, I start to feel moved as I hear the person's backstory, what they've been through, their formative experiences, particularly not always, but particularly their childhood story. And then the compassion for that person, even if it's somebody that I initially dislike, the compassion comes in all by itself. You could say that it's almost like an accident of the dialogue. My body produces the compassion without my needing to impose it. I don't sit and tell myself I must be more compassionate. I don't do compassion meditations. I don't try to conjure or manufacture the feeling of compassion. In the loveliest way, I feel like I'm a victim to it. It happens. And I really like that. That's what I wanted to share today. I really like the sense that compassion can be a force that is larger than ourselves, that we are wired for. It is in our design. Like hunger or tiredness or thrill or warmth. Compassion happens to you when you go to the conditions that produce that. When I hear your story, sooner for some people, later for others, and it all depends on, my own blind spots that I have, my triggers. Sooner or later, I start to feel moved. And I began to wonder, I wonder if that's what forgiveness is. There's a sense that it begins with an experience that I like to call the no wonder experience. I've sat with people that have been very violent towards their children, or that are very bigoted in their views, racist, and all kinds of things, and misogynist, and all kinds of things. I've sat in those conversations, being confronted with the discovery that somewhere in me there are those dark, shadowy places as well. And when I hear that the way that person has been treated, I'm flooded by the words that come up for me every time is, no wonder. No wonder that you see the world that way. No wonder that you see others that way. No wonder that you behave and react that way. It's a very, very powerful moment of connection. And it's an alchemical moment, because then it alters the way that I perceive, it alters the way that I speak, it alters the way, the decisions that I make, the way that I interact. Even if it doesn't alter the way that I do my therapy, but it alters my voice in that very much. I think I become a more holding and a more holding kind of a person. And there's movement from that place. So over the years, I began to seek that moment first. Not to seek resolution, not to seek solution, but to seek connection. Once I hear from you, there will be a moment that I'm flooded by a sense of, no wonder. And you will know it. You'll know that. And when I've been with therapists that feel that way for me, sometimes a good therapist, what they've done for me is that when they feel compassion towards me and they say to me, Robin, no wonder you are fearful and anxious in your life in those moments, or no wonder you get depressed, no wonder you're irritable. Look at what happened to you leading up to that. Sometimes their compassion reaches me before and helps me to have a compassion for myself that I did not have until that moment. Look at the power of how this happens between two. Compassion is deeply contagious. It floods us. It overwhelms our barriers. There are so many ways in which this discovery for me, like I guess the discovery is how to language this phenomenon. The implications are enormous, not just in the therapy situation, but in the community building situation and in the political situation. And we could talk, we could open up a tremendous dialogue, really, a long dialogue that we won't have time for today, about how do we live in a time of such enormous, profound, jagged, sharp polarization that is going on around the world. There's so much of a judging and a counter-judging. You know, somebody politically makes judgmental statements, and then somebody on this side judges them for that, and then it's a punch and counter punch of mutual judging. You know, you're the racist, you're the bigot, you know, you're the leftist, you're the something, and we've become more and more and more polarized, and the listening died. What we so need is it's not about not acknowledging the violent behavior that happens. It's not about being in denial about that, but it's about what happens to chronic violence when we begin to listen. And this is something that makes me very happy, that I know that even if I begin by not liking you, if I listen to you enough, I will be touched. If I'm curious about your story, there will be a moment that comes invariably that I will be very deeply moved by you. And then something huge shifts. Rage tends to really soften in that moment. And that very reliably happens. So I like the sense that judgment has a cure, and it is curiosity. Curiosity, the cure to judgment. I think that's such a beautiful thing. There's so much injunction that goes on in public discourse about psychotherapy and counseling and personal growth. There's always somebody waving the finger and saying, don't be so judgmental. And I want to say, let's hold it a minute. Let's look at our own shadow. We're all judgmental. It doesn't help to be judgmental about judgment. Those judgmental voices are kind of incessant. They come and go. And that's okay. Judgment isn't something to be frightened of. It's acting out from the judgment in an unconscious way. Now things get scary. But I have another view of judgment that has dawned upon me, which is that when I become judgmental, and I want to kind of invite you guys to consider this, when I become judgmental and I hear my judgmental voice, rather than smack myself on the wrist, you know, judging myself for being judgmental so that judgment builds on top of itself, my judgment is kind of the shadow of a pain. And underneath that pain, there is a need that once you look into it, it's genuine. It's absolutely for a good reason. So the substance of the judgment might be nonsensical, but it's a symptom. And it's okay. If I don't act out from that place, then it's just a kind of a sound in the air. And judgment doesn't stay. It doesn't stay in the face of curiosity. Curiosity washes it. I want to share a dream I had once. I remember back in the days of George W. Bush, and I remember in those years what it felt like to think, well, it can never get worse than this. There can never be a president more frightening, more inarticulate. It will never happen. This is going to be as bad as it gets. And I'll acknowledge that I hated him. Especially when it came time to the war and etc. You know the whole story. Well, he really frightened me, and his system frightened me, and I know that that's a shared thing. You know, and the agreement festival that grows around that, because all of my friends, all of my people said the same things, and we just kind of fed off of each other's resentment and hatred. One night I had a dream, and George Bush, he came to me in this dream as I think like a 9-year-old boy, dressed in a cowboy suit, swaggering, and full of joy because he was pretending to be a shoot-'em-up kind of cowboy from an old Western movie, and just being innocent and playful like a kid, but trying to, you know how little boys just love nothing more than to be a superhero. And I saw him in that place, and I was so touched, and I so recognized that part of myself. I woke up, and from that day forward, I was biochemically unable to hate him anymore. And what was interesting for me, I still deeply wanted him for him to be politically disempowered. I thought, to me, it's a state of emergency. He must be removed from power. But that doesn't mean that I need him to be punished, or anybody that believes in him. And that was the experience of that dream is not too dissimilar for me when I get the story of anybody that I fear or I hate. It passes when the no wonder experience comes. So that is so comforting for me to know that curiosity dissolves judgment. And when I can't find that place, I know that if I hear your story of how you came to be in the place where you are, I will be moved. There's a commonality in our stories. Every one of us was an unborn child in our mother's womb. Every one of us was born. Every one of us was a baby. Every one of us had elders. Rejection hurts. Punishment and violence terrifies. We've all felt a little bit of horror, abandonment. There's a universality in that, where my body recognizes some aspect of what you've been through, and vice versa. And even though in the detail we're also entirely different. Yeah, that's a lot of what drives my love of inner child work. Um, there's no hurry, or there's no kind of imperative to get to some kind of an end goal of fixing or solving. To me, that's so much less nourishing and fulfilling than the moment of connection that happens between you and I. When you see my soul through my telling of my story, and when I see your soul through your telling of your story, I have come to really trust story. And story is not just about details and not about chronology and remembering the year that this happened or the year that that happened. It's the feeling, the internal feeling. How was it for you to be 7 years old? What did the adult seem like to you when you were that age? What did that experience or this experience feel like for you inside when you went through this and when you went through that, when you went through that? That is such a golden moment. I mean, I must have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours sitting in group therapy. And it is so life-giving, that moment when somebody becomes intentionally vulnerable. It's usually through story. Whether it's what happened with my lover or my wife or husband or partner or whatever last week, or something that I lived through as a teenager, or whatever it is, that a few words about story, and with intentional vulnerability, there's a sense of dropping down and we connect. Nothing to resolve, just to show. And then everyone in the room is fed by that experience. There's a silence that descends, a beautiful silence that descends into a room where we know that we are all moved by, we recognize ourselves in each other. We're moved by the person telling the story. That moment is so profoundly transformative and nourishing. And it has these wonderful and I think quite magical implications for everything else that we do from that moment. I love the power of story to bring that about so naturally and so inevitably. That's why I like to ask, how was it for you as a child, or how was it? It's not to fix something or to get an answer, it's not about a mental understanding so much as that's how we connect. And you can ask about me whenever you like as well, if that's important to you. And I'll share what I can. I like to call this, I don't think we need to say to each other, it's time for you to forgive. I think that completely blocks things and gets in the way. I just don't like that. And I don't like the sense of that push and the expectation. That comes out of not trusting that compassion happens, like warmth happens. So I want to share this idea with you, a concept that came to me, which is, I personally, and I could be wrong, it's fine, but my belief right now, I don't think that you can you can decide to forgive by virtue of willing it to happen. Or I don't think that we can decide to be compassionate by virtue of willing it to happen. That's not what the will is. I think that's often going to be a lie where, and it's so easy to lie to ourselves and pretend where we half feel something instead of all the way down. That's kind of like trying to manufacture the outcome. However, I have a different idea about the will, the human will, and I want to call that the prebiotic. This is kind of fun in a way. The prebiotic theory of the will. I'll explain what I mean by that. When you take a prebiotic, you're not adding bacteria to your gut. You're fertilizing the soil of your gut to create the conditions in which the healthy bacteria will grow all by themselves. So you're not fertilizing the soil, you're not adding fertilizer, you're just helping the soil. You're adding a prebiotic to make the soil healthy. In that, growth will happen, because growth happens. Growth is what happens. You cannot stop growth. We're not in charge of that. The universe grows, life grows. So the prebiotic theory of the world, like as I said earlier, I can't decide to get warm in my body, but I can create the conditions in which warmth happens. I can step to where the sun is shining for a while. Warmth will happen and I will feel warm. And if I stay there too long, it's not warmth anymore. So I need to just walk myself to where the right conditions are. That's what sharing our stories is. I don't need to try to feel compassion towards you. That will happen to me. I'll create the conditions in which that will happen to me. Prebiotically. Curiosity about your story will bring that about. And I'm hoping that makes sense. I'd like at this point to, I'm waiting for a plane to fly over. Can you hear that plane, Kate? Sorry about that. Somebody's doing either there's a training pilot or they're doing a joy flight. They're having a ball. I can't wait for electric planes, actually. A lot quieter. So I want to open this up to questions and comments. Shall we go there?
Yeah. So you are welcome to.
Particularly, I'm sorry, Kate.
Yeah.
And if there's something about what I'm saying that bugs you and worries you, I want to hear about that too. People have, that comes up a lot, and it's interesting. So bring that up too. So let's see how many questions we can fit in with the time that we have.
Well, Andy Hamilton, he writes in. Andy, do you want me to read your question, or do you want to come on and dialogue with Robin? You can open your microphone. I'll bring you in. Please read. Okay. I'm interested in thoughts around forgiveness when someone remains completely righteous around their behavior. In the case I'm thinking of, genuine compassion was there initially through understanding of story, but it has been really difficult to maintain in the face of indignant and defensiveness around the behavior. So the question is how to remain in that forgiveness or compassionate place when someone is completely righteous.
Okay.
It's a good question.
It's a really good question. And doesn't that happen a lot? And aren't we thinking that a lot? I used to feel that way so much about my dad. my very, very, very dear departed dad. He's been gone for about 8 years now. And that was my way of describing him a lot, like infinitely self-righteous, and he would hold on to his position, and we would have a lot of, often in the form of a political argument. My God, we fought. And that was incredibly painful and deeply frustrating for me, and profoundly disappointing, and it was never going to change. And, you know, why do we need to, you know, I wasn't able to stay compassionate in the face of that. I was angry. I was hurt by his judgment, you know, and you can't do that. I just don't think that you can maintain, as the question, as Andy, as your question says, to maintain a state of compassion. Why do we expect that of ourselves? Why do we expect ourselves to be like the description of a saint? You wouldn't go up to a 7-year-old child and say, why can't you be more like a 15-year-old? Why can't you, or why can't, better still, why can't you get a job? Growth never happens because you expect it to happen. Growth happens because you bring interest and curiosity and acceptance and love into where you are. And now in the face of, I'll come back to my relationship with my dad, in the face of my relationship with my dad, in which he was a deeply self-righteous man. And by the way, my dad adored George Bush and believed in his politics. I remember George Bush loved his politics. I wonder what my dad would have made of the current president. And I needed to find forgiveness for my own reactivity around my dad, because I felt triggered by him. But the more that I learned about his story, you just get right out of the argument of politics, right out of that. We're just not going to agree. The more that I understood what motivated him, the more that I heard his stories about what he lived through during the war in Romania, the Second World War, what he lived through as a child in hunger. There was some big, no wonder. I mean, he carried enormous amount of, he was Jewish man in Romania during the Second World War. He lived through an enormous amount of terror and humiliation, and his life was narrowly saved many times. There are moments where I think about him and I just feel like, oh, no wonder. And if I had been in his shoes, I would be exactly as righteous and unmoving as he was. I'm sure of it. So the argument is immaterial. I noticed that over the years, it's not that I've stopped being angry when I think about my dad. That's subject to being triggered for me. It comes back and I lose my compassion in that moment. And that's okay, because when I think about what he lived through, the compassion just comes in floods, actually. You know, he told me what it felt like to be in Bucharest in Romania, and when American soldiers came and chased away the Nazis. And he kind of fell in love with those guys in their tanks and became bonded with Americanism. And from that moment, he was like, from afar, like an American exceptionalist, and everything American was gold, and nothing would shift him from that position. But that's the nature. That's the nature of what terror does to us, unless there's a deep healing process. Now, I have benefited from years and years and years of the human potential movement and the therapies and the group therapies and the open dialogue and this psychological society that we live in which we talk openly about these things. My parents, and for most of our parents, didn't have any of that. So no wonder they couldn't move from their positions. So I have to ask myself, and I think that this is a worthwhile question to ask, why does my pleasure, my well-being depend on my father not being self-righteous anymore, or that person over there who's bigoted or whatever, not being bigoted and hard in their views anymore? Why does my pleasure, my inner well-being, spiritual well-being depend on that person making a shift in their views? I tell you what, the views is really not where it's at. But the story of the person is a profound window. How about if I stop changing your views, but ask you about you? Something happens. Something huge happens. And then sometimes the other person softens in their views, sometimes not. But how about that not being the goal for a moment, so that we can really, really connect and depolarize? So in a way, Andy, your question, how to stay compassionate? Well, don't try to stay compassionate. Can you be compassionate to the fact that you lose your compassion, and sometimes you're going to get hurt and sad and angry and disappointed and alienated and all kinds of things. That's okay. Welcome to our humanness. Curiosity, story, no wonder, connection. And I love that moment. I love that moment. Thanks for your question, Andy. Somebody else.
Laurie Schwartz has her hand up. Laurie, would you like to come on live, or would you like to type in a question?
Come on live.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Thank you. Robin, I could fall in love with you. I mean, I just completely adore everything you're saying, and it so feeds my soul and resonates. Just everything you're saying, it's hitting the core to me. It's almost like a synchronicity is happening, because what you're saying, I've been writing and journaling for the past 6 months since COVID began. I lost a brother to heroin overdose, and my mother was schizophrenic, and my Holocaust relatives died in the Holocaust. So I started praying when I was 8, when my mother had a psychotic break. And something about prayer and something said, I need to understand people. And my only way through was to listen to my mother's pain, my father's pain, my brother's pain. And where I am now as a trauma specialist, and Kate and I trained together in birth work for 2 years. And so I remember when I did a birth session once, and there were 8 of us. It was a Ray Castellino 8-hour birth session. Everyone was dead when I came out of my session. Everyone was sleeping. And I thought, wow, this is curious. What is it about my existence that everyone fell asleep when I was doing my birth session? And what I realized when I started to understand is that I had the Holocaust in me, and I had the fear and the terror and the rage. So I've scared a lot of people for many years with my intensity for truth. And what I know now, since my brother died of heroin, a fentanyl overdose, and I spent years in rehabs in the United States, 25 halfway houses, 5 rehabs. I kept saying, we need to love them. We need to not shame the addicts. They're only taking a drug because we as a species don't know how to be in the pain with compassion. And so if you have a mentally ill relative or a drug addicted relative, you're in 2 worlds. You're loving them, you know that it's a family disease, and our society is shaming them, and then suicide goes up. So when I was asked to speak about addiction and overdose by a rabbi, a Chabad rabbi, he said, give people hope. And I kept saying, what is God? If God is not the truth of love that permeates our bodies, and God is everything, and the only way to go through is to come out of duality. The only way I can come out of duality is to sit with Trump and say, what was this man's childhood like? Why did he end up where he is? He's a manifestation of our culture. He's the wounded patriarch. He's not a bad person. He's just living his life. And if we could all listen to what you're saying and just listen to each other's stories, we could shift the planet in a week. It's the shift of consciousness that you're talking about that is so inspiring to me. And I just want to thank you for everything you shared. I took a lot of notes and I typed a lot on Facebook because I just wanted to keep saying, talk, you know, and because my brother's in heaven and because I've talked to a few psychics, he's talking to me every day. And this is him. You know, and he's holding the picture of his guru. I mean, he
Beautiful
was a
guy.
man. He was so beautiful.
Yeah. Beautiful,
you know, and
brother.
So many people. He was
Ah.
like, and I crack, and he says to me, it's all about love. The day he died, he left a poem called Nonstop Eternal Love. And he said, when I die, do not mourn my death. Celebrate life, celebrate love, and celebrate relationships. And know that I'll always be with you. and you'll always be with me, and we're one forever. And as the Jewish lineage, even though I feel African, I feel Indian, it's really about the breath and the heart that you're speaking, right? It goes cross-cultural. What you're speaking is beyond identity, even though the wounds teach us to listen.
I do believe that, Laurie, and thank you for sharing all of that. And I do believe that this is a culture proof. It makes a kind of you know, we're incredibly diverse and interesting, and there are, you know, certain areas in which we don't understand each other across our ethnicities, and that's actually, it can just makes life very, very interesting potentially. But there is a deeper place in which we're utterly universal, and that there's a deep, you know, that deep core,
I mean, I joined the Peace
emotional
Corps.
place, and that is culture proof, really. That we, you know, some things that we understand about each other deep down, like I am you, you are me, and closer to the surface, we can't understand each other, but there's room for that to actually be just fun and interesting. And
I mean, I did go to Africa. I was in the Peace Corps for 3 years.
Right.
And I became a drummer. And something about being in an African country for 3 years, and you get interested in their music and their songs and their dances and their way of life, and there's joy. And if there's anything, it's what you're talking about, the probiotic. We really need to dance together and sing together and listen to each other's stories with the heart that you're speaking of. Then the traumas dissolve.
It's
like
curiosity. I want to say a couple of things, if I may, Laurie. There's a couple of threads, because there's so many things that you've shared. There's a couple of threads that I really want to pick up on. One is, to me, what I love about curiosity is it reminds me, the metaphor for me is surfing. If you watch somebody surfing, they trust the wave will carry them. They don't need to make it happen. Once you're on that wave, your job's to get on the wave. Once you're on the wave, you get carried. You just dance on it, right? You dance on it, and that curiosity does that. It'll you know, like your experience in Africa, where your curiosity opens a tremendous window in which you start to feel a kind of a delicious enjoyment of the other, the stranger, and it starts to infiltrate you and become a part of you, and you start to become closer and to the rhythm of the other, and it starts to feel more familiar and more of a part of you, and there isn't that strange way in which you say, "Oh, I feel a little bit African today," and or whatever the curiosity bridge has been built for you. The other thing that I want to say, that you reminded me of an issue of the behavior that emerges from trauma, the violence against the self that comes of addiction, and the, you know, the acting in, and often the violence against each other that comes from trauma. And I feel it's incredibly important to make the distinction between the no wonder experience of, you know, once I know your story, something in me will just be arrested. And there's a deep sense of understanding, not mental understanding, but my viscera understands. That if I was in your shoes, I would be you. I would be reacting like you and feeling like you. And, you know, I don't have a belief in God, but the word God comes in a lot. We say, oh my God, what you've lived through. It's interesting to me that sometimes that's the only word that one can say. to cover the experience. But I want to make the distinction is that that doesn't mean accepting behavior. That's completely separate. And if I can go back to that one example of my relationship with my father, that the older I get, the more that I understand and love my dad. And more than that, I'm awed by him. Absolutely awed by who he was. I'm overwhelmed by the magnificence of this man. But if you sat him in front of me right now, and with all of the forgiveness that I have in my heart, that is a growing thing for me, and if he picked on me for one of my ideas in the way that he used to, and he starts putting me down and shaming me and shouting at me and all of that stuff, I'd fight with him tooth and nail in the same way that I did when I was 15. Because I'm still not going to accept the behavior, if you know what I mean. Maybe I wouldn't fight. Maybe I'll come up with something better to do. But it doesn't mean accepting the behavior. It doesn't mean us not being very assertive about, I don't want you to do that to yourself, or you can't do that to me, or don't do that to each other. Okay. And it feels important for me to really delineate and make that distinction, because a lot of people say, gosh, if you start forgiving people, then what do you do to criminals? You give them a massage and you send them out in the street. No, that's not what it leads to. If we had more time, and we'll need to finish off very soon, if we had more time, we could talk about the correction system, the jails in Norway, Scandinavian jails. I mean, murderers go in there, and they get you should see the way they're treated. It's not about punishment. They get the doors to their cells are left open. They get taught things. They get to go outside. They get to have their families come and visit. I don't have time to tell you more, but it's more like a retreat, a healing retreat. And it's such a discontinuity from what we know a prison to be that it would shock you if you see it for the first time. Most people look at that and will say, oh, so what do? You they get angry. You just massage a criminal, then they just go off and do it all again. Everyone will want to commit a crime to go into that jail. All of that stuff, because we all carry so much of a feeling of vengeance. We want to punish. And there's a reason why maybe I should do a part 2. Why is there a punishment impulse in human beings? I've learned a lot about that recently, of the revenge impulse. But I want to leave you with this thought. The recidivism rate in terms of reoffending, it's 3 times lower than it is in Australia and the United States. Okay? Punishment does not work. It creates more crime. Restorative justice works. It helps the community. Restorative justice. And forgiveness is implicit in that. Although an offender needs to be put in some boundaries. We need to say no to the behavior very, very, very assertively. However, once we say no and take away the power for you to hurt people, I want to know your story, because if I was in your shoes, I would probably behave like you. And genetically speaking, no matter who you are my family. Okay, so I think, Kate, we need to wind up. And in winding up, I did want to let you know that so the next intake for our Inner Child Journeys online training course, this is for qualified practitioners. If you're a counsellor, a psychotherapist, a therapist of some kind, a health practitioner, doctor, and you work in a healing capacity, you're a healer, you work in a healing capacity with people, we would like, Kate and I, to invite you to join our next online course. Inner Child Journeys. It's based on my book, Inner Child Journeys. That's available as a Kindle and as a paperback. You can buy it with all of the online stores. Check it out. Essentially, that's what that book is about. It's a handbook. It's a manual for inner child work in the way that I like to do it. My interpretation of that journey. I love it. It's a wonderful dance. It's it's based on very, very sound neuropsychology principles, and it's I think a great way to move forward when there's judgment, when we're triggered. You know, how to identify the need that comes from, the deep developmental need, and how to nourish that need so that we can all have better connections. I know of no better conflict resolution tool, how to depolarize relationships. And Kate and I at this point are offering a discount. Kate, you can talk about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Robin, and thank you for everyone for coming. And we had some more questions. Maybe we can have a part 2 that we can talk more about forgiveness, especially for the self and for people who've hurt us, whom we can't really have a dialogue with anymore. But I'll be sending out the link to this talk to everyone who's registered, along with a 20% off coupon for the Inner Child Journeys, which is starting on Monday. Yeah, Monday in the US and Tuesday in Australia. So thank you, Robin.
Can I, Kate, before we sign off, to say one quick thing that
Yes.
What we're creating through this training, the Inner Child Journeys training online, is a community of healers, therapists, counselors, etc., that are familiar with this method, very inner child aware. And so we have we have formed a Facebook page for the graduates of the people that have taken this course with us, and it creates a community. And we're wanting that it's an international community. We're wanting that to become like a supportive community where there's dialogue and we share things with each other and ask questions and get excited. And I really want to see. To grow an international culture where it's more normal to be asking each other instead of just acting and reacting. And, you know, particularly with our children, you know, they trigger us and we react towards them. Well, I would like to see a growing international culture where it's more normal and more immediate to ask ourselves a question: why am I reacting this way? What has triggered me? And when I identify that trigger, instead of just doing something to my child or to my partner or to my neighbor, to identify what's been triggered in me and using that as an opportunity for my own healing. And out of that comes some absolutely transformed visions and perspectives about who the other person is. Our decisions become better decisions and how we relate from that point. So I want to see that happen a lot more. And so that's the other purpose of the course. And I'd love to see some of you there. Thank you all so very much for sharing this time with Kate and I. And it's lovely to see you all. I love that we can connect around the planet this way. And is there anything, Kate, that we need to say in order to sign off?
No, just thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks for coming on Friday night or Saturday morning. See you.